Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the neighborhood you've lived in for 20 years is no longer what it was. Not visually, not yet, but legally, structurally, fundamentally. The rules that govern what could be built next to you, behind you, across the street from you, those rules have changed. And nobody knocked on your door, asked if that was okay. This is not a hypothetical. This is Vancouver. And if you own property in the city or rent in it or simply live in it, what just happened matters more than most people realize. Stay with us until the end, because the full weight of what's changed doesn't land in the first headline. It lands quietly in land assessments and demolition permits and rental listings that didn't exist 6 months ago. The picture takes time to come into focus. So let's build it together. To understand why Vancouver's zoning map was effectively redrawn, you have to understand the pressure that had been building for years. Vancouver is, by nearly every major index, one of the least affordable cities in the world. Not just Canada, the world. For decades, the relationship between housing supply and housing demand in this city has been broken. Demand climbs, supply crawls, and the gap between them is measured in human cost. Young families priced out, long-time renters displaced, essential workers commuting hours each day because they simply cannot afford to live near where they work. The roots of this crisis are structural. Vancouver sits between mountains and ocean with limited buildable land. Its single-family neighborhoods, vast, quiet, leafy, have historically been protected by zoning codes that prevented densification. A typical residential lot in East Vancouver or Kitsilano or Riley Park could only legally hold one house, sometimes a secondary suite in the basement. That was it. Thousands of acres of city land, locked into a pattern of low density that made perfect sense in 1960 and almost none in 2024. For years, municipal governments debated, plans were drawn and shelved, affordability strategies were launched and quietly abandoned. The political will to touch single-family zoning, to tell homeowners that their neighborhood might change, was simply never there. And then the province stepped in. Bill 44, the Housing Statutes Amendment Act. If there's a single piece of legislation that explains why Vancouver's zoning map looks different today, this is it. Passed by the BC provincial government, Bill 44 effectively ended local government's ability to preserve single-family zoning as a default in urban municipalities. It didn't ask cities to change. It required them to. And it did so with a timeline that left very little room for delay. Under Bill 44, municipalities across British Columbia, including Vancouver, were directed to allow small-scale, multi-unit housing on lots that had previously been restricted to single-family use. In practical terms, this meant that a lot which could previously hold one home could now, depending on its size and location, hold 3, 4, 5, or 6 units. The provincial government was, in effect, overriding decades of local zoning philosophy in a single legislative stroke. Then came Bill 25. Where Bill 44 set the framework, Bill 25 tightened the enforcement timeline. Municipalities that failed to update their zoning bylaws in compliance with provincial direction faced the prospect of provincial intervention, essentially having their zoning decisions made for them. This was not a suggestion. This was a deadline with consequences. For city councils that had spent years dancing around a housing question, the choice was suddenly very simple: act now or have the province act for you. Vancouver, to its credit, moved. The city undertook one of the most sweeping rezonings in its history, converting vast swaths of its residential land base from RS zoning, that is, single-family residential, to new frameworks that permitted multiplexes. The designation that became central to this shift was R1 and its successive variations, including what is broadly understood as multiplex permitting zoning. Where once a standard lot allowed one home, the new rules allowed builders and homeowners to construct up to 4 units as of right, meaning without needing a lengthy rezoning application or public hearing. On larger lots near transit corridors, the allowances climbed higher still. The speed of this change is worth pausing on. In the span of roughly 2 years, Vancouver moved from a city where single-family zoning was the dominant land use designation in its residential areas to one where multiplex construction is the legal default across most of those same areas. That is not an incremental policy shift. That is a structural transformation of the city's housing framework. And here is where things get more complicated. When land is upzoned, when its permitted use expands, its value changes. This is not controversial economics. It is simple market logic. A lot that can legally hold 6 rental units is worth more to a developer than a lot that can only hold 1 house. And so, almost immediately after the zoning changes came into effect, something began to happen in Vancouver's real estate market that surprised some homeowners and alarmed some renters. Developers started knocking on doors, not metaphorically, literally, in neighborhoods across East Vancouver, in the Grandview Woodland Corridor, in parts of Renfrew and Hastings Sunrise. Homeowners began receiving unsolicited offers, letters, phone calls, sometimes door-to-door visits from developers or their agents. The pitch was straightforward. Your land is now worth more than your house. We would like to buy it. And for some homeowners, particularly older residents sitting on properties they'd owned for decades, the numbers being offered were genuinely extraordinary. But for every homeowner who sees opportunity in upzoning, there's a renter who sees something else entirely. Because the housing that has historically been most affordable in Vancouver is not new housing. It is old housing, aging rental apartments, basement suites, secondary dwellings tucked beneath or behind family homes that have been rented for decades at rates that, while not cheap by global standards, are significantly lower than anything newly constructed. This is a housing that the most economically vulnerable Vancouverites depend on, and this housing sits overwhelmingly on exactly the kinds of lots that have just been upzoned. When a developer buys a property and prepares to build 4 or 6 new units, the existing structure is almost always demolished. That basement suite generating $800 or $1,000 a month in rent disappears. The renter living there is given notice and asked to find somewhere else. And the new units that replace it, purpose-built rental, if the developer has opted for that model or straight condominiums, will come to market at rents or prices that reflect the current cost of construction, which is extraordinarily high. The affordable unit is gone. Its replacement costs twice as much. The supply has technically increased, but the affordable supply has not. This is the central contradiction at the heart of Vancouver's rezoning story. And to see it in its most concentrated form, you need only look at the Broadway plan. Stretching from Clark Drive to Arbutus Street along the Broadway corridor, the Broadway plan represents one of the largest and most ambitious redevelopment frameworks in Vancouver's history. It envisions transforming a mid-rise, mixed-use corridor into a dense urban spine of towers, retail, and transit-oriented development, anchored by the Broadway subway extension. On paper, it is a visionary document, tens of thousands of new homes, improved walkability, jobs, and density concentrated near transit. The kind of urban planning that cities around the world are striving toward. But the Broadway corridor, before the cranes arrived, was also home to thousands of renters living in older apartment buildings. 3- and 4-story walk-ups built in the 1960s and 1970s that charged rent significantly below what anything new would cost. As the Broadway plan has moved from policy document to active rezoning reality, those buildings have begun to be bought, emptied, and approved for demolition. The pipeline is long, the displacement is real, and the replacement housing, when it finally comes, years from now, will serve a different income bracket than the housing it replaced. The city is not unaware of this tension. Vancouver has implemented a range of tenant protections that, at least in theory, are designed to soften the impact of displacement. Tenants in buildings facing redevelopment are generally entitled to a minimum notice period before they must vacate. Relocation assistance, a monetary payment intended to help cover moving costs and the rent differential, is provided in many cases. And some rezonings come with right of return provisions, meaning displaced tenants are, in principle, entitled to rent a unit in the replacement building at a rate they can afford. In practice, however, these protections face significant limitations. The gap between the rent a displaced tenant was paying and the rent a new unit commands can be thousands of dollars per year, and a one-time relocation payment does not close that gap. The right of return sounds equitable until you consider that the replacement building may not be completed for 5 or 10 years, during which time the tenant must find and maintain housing in one of the tightest rental markets on the continent. For many, the disruption is simply too great. They leave the neighborhood. Some leave the city, and yet the counterargument is not trivial. Vancouver's housing crisis did not emerge because too many homes were built. It emerged in significant part because not enough were built for long enough. The single-family zoning model that preserved low-rise residential neighborhoods also preserved their inaccessibility. Every year that density was delayed was another year that a nurse, a teacher, a young couple with a modest income could not find a place to live in the city they worked in. The argument for upzoning is, at its core, an argument that a city cannot solve a housing shortage without building more housing. And you cannot build more housing without changing the rules that prevented it. The question of whether this trade-off is worth making, whether the disruption to existing affordable housing is justified by the long-term gain in overall supply, is one that reasonable people genuinely disagree about. Housing economists tend to argue that supply expansion will, over time, moderate rents across the market. Tenant advocates tend to argue that the short and medium-term pain falls disproportionately on the people with the least capacity to absorb it. Both are telling the truth. They are describing different parts of the same reality. For homeowners who are not planning to sell, the rezoning creates a different kind of uncertainty. Your property's assessed value may increase, potentially significantly, as the land beneath your home is now understood by the market to have higher development potential. This is, in one sense, a paper gain that means very little to someone who intends to live in their home indefinitely. But it also means that your property tax assessment may increase, even if your circumstances haven't changed. And it means that the neighborhood around you may change faster than you expected, as neighbors who are willing to sell begin to do so and redevelopment projects begin to appear on streets that have looked the same for 40 years. Not every upzoned lot will be redeveloped immediately. Development depends on land assembly, financing, construction costs, and market conditions. And right now, construction in British Columbia is expensive. Many of the lots rezoned under the new multiplex framework will sit unchained for years before anyone moves to develop them. The zoning change is not a demolition notice. It is a permission. What gets built, when and at what cost, depends on forces that the zoning bylaw alone cannot control. But the permission is real. And once a city changes its zoning, those changes are extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The political and economic interests that align behind upzoning, landowners who benefit from higher assessments, developers who benefit from expanded buildable density, housing advocates who believe in the supply argument, are formidable. The direction of travel in Vancouver is clear. The city is being densified. The question is not whether, but how, and at what human cost, and whether the affordability that the rezoning was intended to create will actually materialize for the people who need it most. Vancouver is entering a new era.